I'm excited to show you the vaccine data that we have attained through a data source called Our World in Data. And I can point you to the source and you can just send me a comment or a note or a message. And I'd be happy to point you to the way that they've aggregated the data and how they're showing data on a global basis as far as vaccines. And the reason why I'm very, very excited about vaccination data is because it isn't every decade or even half a century where we are able to see on a case by case basis or in a day by day basis how an epidemic like this is being treated and being cured. And so that's why I'm excited to show you the vaccination data, regardless of my beliefs or your beliefs about COVID 19 or vaccinations in general. This is very, very interesting from a data science perspective, definitely. And so, without further ado, here's the data and here's the analysis. And it's no surprise as we start off to show you that the United States and China have vaccinated and or received the most vaccines in these past 2 weeks that we have received data. This is brand new data that we're receiving as far as 2 weeks, and so the United States and China have closely about the same as far as 4.5 million vaccines. And Israel and the UAE and Russia uh, all have all have deployed vaccines as well. And Israel is in my mind very surprising, but when I thought about it, it really isn't because one of their companies partnered with an American company to develop a vaccine, and so they were able to gain access and essentially leapfrog a lot of other countries in terms of like getting vaccines and deploying vaccines. And it's very, very interesting, and I'll show you um, why and how um, these countries compare in terms of their timeliness in deploying vaccines and all of that. To give a little context, in terms of COVID deaths, there have been 2 million people that have died from COVID. The United States is the top country in terms of COVID deaths, followed by Brazil, India, and Mexico, and then Italy, and then the UK. And so this is no surprise. You can find this data almost anywhere, but I wanted to put it in here as context for vaccines. And the reason why is because once we do it on a side by side basis, we can see the countries that have the most COVID deaths and the countries that are receiving the vaccines. And they're not the same countries. Not like close, but not exact. So the United States, yes, they recorded the most COVID deaths and they have the most vaccinations. But China hasn't not for some reason recorded the most COVID deaths, and you can argue about data availability and or um, their their reporting of data. That's totally fine, and I'm not sure if I believe that. Where's China on this list? It's way down on this list. I don't know how many people they record as far as COVID deaths, but I don't know if it's accurate. But they're saying that they have 4.5 million vaccinations. But Israel has Israel's down here on the list, and they have maybe 4,000, 3,000. Yeah, they have 3,000, over 3,000 COVID deaths, but they have already deployed 1.1 million vaccines. And it's really, really interesting because Brazil, India, Mexico, and Italy, they haven't even received any large amount of vaccines. And so this is illuminating for me because I've seen a lot of posts on the internet and or news things about the countries that have suffered the most should get the most vaccines. Fair enough, that's true, but I'm not seeing the data. The data is not proving that out at all. And so maybe it will change, and I'm hopeful that it will. But the United States, China, and Israel, the UAE, and Russia are the ones that are getting in these 2 weeks the bulk of the vaccines. But the important thing that we've understood and we've noticed is that the metric to follow is vaccination rates or vaccines per 100 people. And the reason why is because if you have a vaccination rate of 70 or 80%, that means that only 20% of the population can suffer from COVID and be at risk for dying of COVID or anything else of that nature. And so in that way, The vaccines for Israel, as far as 1.1 million vaccines, goes a long way to vaccinate their population. They already have 13 to 15% of their population vaccinated, while the United States sits at 1%, over 1% of their population vaccinated. And so the United States won't reach 15% of their vaccination rate anytime soon, while Israel is clocking at a per 1% of their population per day. So 1% of their population is being vaccinated. So in 50 or 60 or 70 days, they could reach a vaccination rate of 50 or 60 or 70%. And this graph here shows the vaccination rate versus the total vaccinations. And so United States and China are here at the top, while Bahrain, UAE, and Israel are sitting here as far as having a higher vaccination rate. And this chart shows essentially how Israel compares to other countries. As you can see, the data is very early, and so these little dots of these little dots show one recorded instance of countries receiving vaccines. And so this is very early on in terms of data as far as what we have already. But Israel's just off the charts. Like they're they're out of the ballpark as far as vaccination rates. It's really quite astounding and quite impressive. But if you've ever visited Israel or know anything about Israel, I spent some time in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I know that they're no business. Like they're no joke about deploying and getting things done. And I believe and I assume that they had a plan to execute, and they executed it, and they're going to execute it as flawlessly as possible. Um, Vaccination rate, we've seen this before, but interestingly enough, smaller countries like Croatia and Malta and Portugal, they can improve their vaccination rate with a lot fewer vaccines. And so they only need to negotiate a fewer number of vaccine shipments to make a big difference in their population. And what that means is that a country like Portugal or Malta or Croatia, if they receive a 50 or 60% vaccination rate, that means that they can essentially, if they'd like to, go back to being fully normal or fully operational with maybe a few restrictions, but nothing like what they were seeing before. And so that's why the power of having a vaccination rate is really important in monitoring that, because Israel, I assume that in three months they will be able to have have stores open, be able to go into offices and and operate at a level where the United States could only dream of at the end of 2021. Lastly, I just put a fun chart in here showing the comparison between Israel and the United States. Israel, as of January 4th, has 15% of their population vaccinated, while the United States is still trucking along over here at 1.38, 1.5% of their population. So the United States still has a lot of work to do, while Israel, they've deployed in an unprecedented level. And I think this will be a case study to show on a global scale what are effective practices for vaccines and deploying vaccines on a global scale. We've never seen this before. This is a new thing. And we have data, and hopefully we'll get data to show how effective different countries, municipalities, states are in treating COVID-19, which is really exciting. And so stay tuned. I'm hopeful that the United States will come out with local and state level data on an aggregate basis that we can analyze. But so far, we only have global data, and that's what we have to go off of. If you have any questions or thoughts or comments, feel free to leave a comment below and or just send us a note or message if you have any questions, and we'd be happy to answer them and or point you into the right direction if you have any questions about data, etc. Thanks for listening, and talk to you later.